David, I'm going to start by sort of asking you, because you're somebody that has so many things that you've done, so many things that you do. And we've spent a lot of time talking about identity in this festival. And we don't do this anymore, but once upon a time on your passport, it used to say, Jude Kelly, theatre director, or whatever.
Yeah.
So if it still said that on your passport, what would you like it to say?
Well, I've been thinking about this a bit recently because I get asked a lot, what is it that you do? Because people are baffled. And, primarily I still think of myself as a comedian, but I have written serious stuff, and I have particularly the type of comedy that I'm doing at the moment, because I returned to stand-up recently. And in fact, my new stand-up show that I'm developing is about my mother who died last December and my father's dementia. So that's not obvious comedy subjects, but it is, I think, a funny show, and it still gets laughs. But what I'm coming to is the answer, which is that I think I'm primarily a storyteller. And I think that in writing whatever I've written, whether it be books or films or stand-up or even journalism, that I'm trying to tell stories. And what I tend to do is, obviously some of those are very made up, but at some level I'm trying to tell stories about truth. A lot of what I do is very detailed, true stories, and what I think, and maleness is sort of very much in this, I think, is that we have a culture, particularly now, I guess we've always had it, where people want quick answers to stuff. They want to know, who they are, what the world is, how it works. And it's very rare. If I have one motto in life, I don't have any mottos really, but it would be the truth is always complex. And maleness is a very good example of that, because it's really hard to say what maleness is, and you can't really sum it up very quickly. So I think in storytelling, you can find a way of getting towards the complexity of various truths, maleness being one of them, which just, doing one thing doesn't really allow you to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, yesterday we were looking at a film called Bam Now that Gemma Kearney had made, where she interviewed lots of boys about 13 and 14 about what it was like to be a boy.
Yeah.
And it was a parallel film to one where girls had been asked that question. And it was really clear that girls were used to being asked a question about being a girl.
Yeah.
But the boys were really floored at the idea of, what do you mean, what's a boy?
Yeah.
They almost like they'd never thought about it. When you were a teenager, an adolescent, was maleness something that you were you exploring it?
No, I don't think so.
Well, you didn't know you were exploring it. You must have been exploring it without knowing it.
Well, I guess I was, but I don't know. I mean, I would say that's a sexist thing, because I would say that the reason that girls and women might have some sense of identifying what that is because being a man is thought of as a default position in culture. It probably still is thought of to some extent as a default position.
You mean the norm?
As a norm, yeah, which is a sexist thing. And it's incorrect, but it has a side effect, I guess, advantage, which is people think, okay, so if that's the norm, we have to explore what a woman is, which allows for that discussion about identity. Now that's started to collapse, it's probably been collapsing for a while, and people realise it's not the norm to be a man, but the conversation about what a man is hasn't been happening for so long, because it's sort of just assumed, oh, you're a bloke, that's just what, the standard thing is. For years, obviously, people said he rather than he or she, and that's because it's just a default position of humanity in the sexist imagination.
So when you were growing up, and then you were sort of going into storytelling on stages, the things that you were doing as a bloke, because you are a bloke, your blokey identity was quite strong at that point. We can define bloke later maybe, but okay. Were you consciously trying to appeal to male audiences and thinking about what the triggers for comedy would be in that context?
A little bit. I don't know if I ever thought of it in that way. What I think happened when I first started doing stand-up was I started doing stand-up in 1986 professionally, and if you went to the Comedy Store at that time, you'd see a lot of brilliant comedians, but they would all be pretty self-consciously political. They'd be, with a capital P, they'd be doing stuff about Margaret Thatcher and the miners and whatever. And I decided not to do that, not because I was against that struggle particularly, but I just thought, well, they're all doing that, I should do something different. And what I chose to do was sort of more personal stuff, more stuff about me, just about my identity, and also, I guess, from that point of view, also about things I liked, which included football and pop music and, you know, kind of blokey interests. And as part and parcel of that, I also, and this wasn't really a self-conscious decision, it's just again to do with the truth thing, I was just sort of fairly straightforward about what it's like to be a bloke and to like those things, you know, and to like women, in fact, and to like women sexually, and to be honest about that. Because I would say, Frank Skinner once told me that when he first started doing stand-up, and he came from an entirely different kind of background and probably didn't have any awareness of what you might call political correctness starting in the 80s, that he did a gig when he came down to London at the Red Rose, and he referred to someone as a girlfriend, someone he knew as a girlfriend of his, and then was chastised after it by a feminist. And so that sort of monitoring of language that was happening in the 80s, and obviously still happens now, I think I wasn't that interested in that and would just speak in a way that felt to me as natural as possible. And so that became associated later on with this idea of new laddishness, which it wasn't really a movement or a thing or anything. It was really just some comedians who had chosen not to be as straightforwardly political as the previous generation of comedians.
Or were also sort of rebelling against some idea of political correctness.
Well, some idea of political correctness.
Yeah.
I never thought of it really like that. I never thought, oh, you know, there's this great weight of political correctness that we're smashing through. I just thought we're going to talk about things that feel more honest and personal to us, not about so much about great sociological things. As a result, we have to use a language that feels more like, you know, less policed.
Yeah.
To be more personal, you have to use a language that is less policed.
And that you know, as you said, society likes quick fixes, quick ideas, you know, likes to land on something that it can describe really quickly.
Yeah.
So that notion of lad culture,
Yeah.
which came in from different directions, you know, the beer adverts, the Loaded magazine,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. When you found yourself sort of in the midst of it,
Yeah.
just because in a sense you and your friends were enjoying banter, enjoying discussions, and actually not policing the language, just being real as you would be in the pub, did it feel like a good thing or a trap, or what was the sense of being part of lad culture? Because you didn't define that, did you?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a very degraded idea now.
Yeah.
But we didn't define it. No, what happened was, I'd actually done a show in Edinburgh, which before I was well known, in about 1987 or 88, called Super Lads, which was a sort of parody, already then a kind of ironic thing about, you know, trying to be more of a lad than you were. My first bit of stand-up began, I'm an intellectual, but I'm also a bit of a lad, and then I tried to define what that meant. And it was all about undercutting the idea that, you know, you were this sort of drinking whatever person. But then I didn't have any sense of this movement. And then me and Rob Newman, who I used to be in a double act with, we were on the cover of City Limits, which I think the audience are old enough to remember, which was a quite a sort of right-on listings magazine. And we were on the cover of it, and Rob decided, whilst we were on the cover of it, to do a kind of page 3 pose. Just he wasn't told to do that. He just started to do a page 3 pose, and I was laughing at him. And then it came out, and then the headline was, "Here come the new lads."
Uh-huh.
And that was the first time I'd heard that phrase. But rather typically, it was sort of defined as a sort of journalistic phenomenon rather than a thing that felt to me that we'd actually decided this is who we are. But then I was perfectly happy to be seen as that for a while. But by the time Loaded started, then it becomes a journalist thing. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's I think, when it's slightly problematic. Because whenever you hear the endless retreading of the 90s, and I'm sometimes on those programmes, and I feel I shouldn't be, but I always am on those, you know, it was great in the 90s or whatever, programmes, then Loaded in particular, which, you know, I don't want to particularly slag it off, but it's defined as the thing that started that.
Yeah.
And it didn't, of course.
No.
It was started in comedy clubs or wherever else it might be started, and then a journalistic thing latches onto it.
You know, it's a funny thing because there's a different tradition altogether which goes back much, much further about sort of, I wouldn't call it lad culture, but the idea of, you know, two men in their bedsit, whether it be the Likely Lads or, you know, Fools and Horses or Morecambe and Wise or Tony Hancock. There's always been this tradition of, you know, the blokes who are fumbling towards trying to sort of be brilliant, and actually underneath it as well, they're also sort of unable to, you know, cook properly, and they've not failed girlfriends, etc., etc.
Yeah.
It's very vulnerable and kind of wonderful, particularly British, I think, as well, or European anyway. And that idea of the double act between you and Frank, where you're sitting in this pretend place, and in through the door comes your most famous person that you want to meet. Is it in that tradition, really, of sort of, you know, a world where the complications of other relationships don't have to exist?
Well, I was living with Frank, and quite a lot of famous people were coming round at the time.
So it really was just what was happening?
It was just me saying, let's just put our life on the telly and see if people will watch it. But one of the interesting things about fantasy football, which I guess formed the apex of that idea of lad culture, whatever you might want to call it, is fantasy football was watched by about 40% female audience. And some of those women, obviously not all of them, but some of them weren't really particularly into football, because I would meet them and they would tell me, oh, I'm not that into football, but I like watching the show. And one woman I remember saying to me, because I said to her, what is it that you like about it if you don't particularly like football? She said, I like watching two men who so clearly love each other. And I thought that's interesting, because we do have possibly more than for women, although hopefully with things like Bridesmaids that's changing, but there's a kind of that bromance thing there's a great sort of affection, quite sentimental affection for it in our culture, you know. And double acts are definitely an idea of it, the sort of double act who are constantly sparring but they really like each other underneath. You know, I remember Frank saying to me because we did live together for 6 years, and then I moved out, and eventually then I had children and stuff like that, him admitting to me that he thought that was never going to happen, and that we would end up like Morecambe and Wise, sharing a bed and, you know, growing old together. And I had to tell him that doesn't happen in real life. Well, maybe it does, but it's not going to happen to us. And he's now got a baby. Everything's fine.
Phew.
Although, interestingly enough, I don't know if people know this. When I moved out, because we lived in a flat, I moved out. I lived in Belsize Park, and he then bought a house 2 doors down from my house. Then I moved again somewhere else, and he's now bought another house in the same street. It's like a very expensive form of stalking. It's really very odd. And yesterday he called me up and he said, Dave, I only live 10 doors down, we're not seeing each other enough. You know, I mean, it's good in a way, as you know, because he's more blokey than me, Frank Skinner, although, I mean, he was an alcoholic, but he doesn't drink anymore. Yeah. I don't know why I said that, just tell you that. But he is more blokey than me.
Well, he drank more than you, consistently.
Yeah, he certainly drank more than me when he was alcoholic, definitely. But he has evolved, that sounds like from a monkey, but what I mean is he's evolved emotionally to someone who really is very open about and vulnerable about talking about stuff like that.
Could you just be careful what you're tweeting if you are tweeting now? Because Frank will probably be on this, stalking you, and be going, what do you mean a monkey?
But he's a good example in terms of this maleness. I mean, he's not here, so I don't know why, but I just think, you know, Frank, I come from a kind of lower middle class Jewish North London environment. It's not very bohemian. I think people probably think it's more bohemian, my background, than it is. It's not. My dad he worked for Unilever, then he got made redundant when he was 40 and sold dinky toys in an antique market. But at the same time, you know, and my mother was a refugee from the Nazis. There was an intellectual element to it, or whatever, and a lower middle class North London element to it, whereas Frank came from the black country, worked in a factory, you know, and then just decided one day, through a leap of the imagination, to sort of stop doing that, go back to college, and then become a comedian. And so in terms of the idea of the sort of one-dimensional idea of a bloke's life, I think it's almost impossible to separate that from class to some extent. And I think that one-dimensional idea is what Frank, as a working-class bloke growing up in the 60s in the black country, embodied, and then changed his mind, and is now the kind of man who can ring up his best friend and say, you know, what's happening, we should talk about our emotions. You know.
Well, I mean, let's just talk about that for a second, because that idea of the two men, the bromance and everything, which I agree people feel a huge affection for, because they want men to be loving and they want men to love each other. But there seems to be masses of reasons why men evade the actual reality of a male friendship that includes sharing vulnerability, talking at length, and so on. I mean, very often it seems that the pattern is that men find women to do that with.
Yeah.
And then in the pub, they resort to banter.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I never went to the pub, you see. You know, I hardly ever go to the pub. People misunderstanding who I was because of the lad culture thing. Sometimes I'd get in a cab, and firstly they'd talk about football, which was fine, but then they'd sometimes say, so where do you drink around here?
Okay, as if the two things go together.
And I would have to say, I basically have a cup of coffee in the mornings, and I never really wanted to go to the pub. I never really wanted to drink loads. I think that's a Jewish thing. I mean, I virtually know no Jewish drinkers. I think it might be just a genetic issue, but I never wanted to just go to the pub and talk like that. But I do think that I was, to some extent, I talked about this in an article that I wrote for the Sunday Times about depression. I think I was kind of born talking about my emotions. I never had any issue with talking about my emotions. And I always thought, I don't understand the idea that it feels weak to express that you feel upset or vulnerable, because that seems obviously brave to me. It's obviously brave to say I'm lonely, or I can't deal with this, or this is troubling me. But I appear to still be in a minority with that as a man. But literally, it is a blind spot of mine to see how you could think that that was a failing, to be able to say that.
Well, it's a good blind spot to have, because it seems to trigger the opportunity for other people, because of you being open. Other people then go, can I talk about my feelings as well?
It's partly to do with being a comedian, because to be a comedian, certainly the type of comedian I am, what you spend a lot of your time doing is absolutely presenting your weaknesses on stage, all your flaws, and I detail them really far too much, and you get laughs from it. So, and I've always thought this, that if you present your flaws and your terribleness as honestly as possible, then you take the sting out of the terribleness of yourself, because people just are endeared to you, hopefully, because you've been so honest about it.
Well, I mean, the bit that you then referred to, which was that you started talking about depression, and recently you started talking about I suppose the trauma of your parents at the end of their lives, but also the background to the tensions and the traumas of their whole life.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, as you say, not necessarily the stuff of comic material, but let's put that to one side for a minute. What did you do to start? I mean, did the depression happen to you, and you then had to analyse what you were going to discuss, why it happened to you? You know, coming clean about everything isn't necessarily what people can do, but your storytelling, did you have a kind of conscience that your storytelling had to include everything that you were thinking about?
Yeah, but I've got a bit of a problem with that, I think. I've got a sort of... I did a tour in 1997, which was called the Too Much Information Tour, and I do think, in general, I tend to just splurge stuff. I mean, I then try and mould it into something entertaining and funny, hopefully, and interesting, so it's not uncontrolled, but I don't... You know, I think I don't have any shame. I think I don't have the gene that allows for shame, and so I will just tell people, both on stage and normally just that I meet, all sorts of things about myself that some people would consider, I think, to be shameful. And it doesn't really occur to me that that's an issue. And certainly depression, it never struck me for a moment to hide the fact that when I started to get depressed, properly depressed, that I shouldn't talk about it.
And when you started to get depressed, were you surprised?
Just to say, Jude, well, we're doing another thing about this,
we
aren't we?
I know,
so
but
I want to keep the gunpowder dry with all the depression stuff, all the depression gear. So should we talk about this, or?
I just wanted to say one thing, really, which was that the sort of realisation that you were, which will be on one of the panels, it's called the Black Dog panel. Was it? That's what I want to know. Was it a surprise? Was it? Did you have to reassess?
The main surprise with it. I don't know if anyone here has suffered from clinical depression, but the main issue with it is, I think when I was a student, and probably when I was in my 20s, I probably thought of myself as often a bit depressed, just for a kind of goth kind of coolness that I thought was associated with depression. Then when I got properly depressed, I realised it's a whole other thing. That being actually clinically depressed isn't really that. It's not. Neither is it that sort of The Cure style pose, or even just feeling sad. It's an actual physical experience that involves a kind of chronic, intense flu-like symptoms with a very high level of anxiety, and you feel actually weighted down by depression. And the tendency of people not to get out of bed, which I think people who haven't got depression think is just them sort of being lazy or not dealing with it. It's because you feel like you can't get up. And so I think I found it very shocking from that point of view, but I never thought for a second that I knew that the only way of getting out of it would be to talk about it.
I mean, I must say the lack of the genetic bit of you that doesn't drink but will talk is probably a lifesaver. I mean, that's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
But so my last question before we open up to the audience really is about the recent things you've talked about mortality.
Yeah.
I mean, you've said I wanted to make sure that I recognise that death is coming in some way.
Have I said that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And therefore,
I've got to work on my comedy, haven't I? It's not.
So what am I going to make sure I am doing with my truth, my storytelling? And you're prolific. You've just writing. You just published another children's book. You are a best-selling children's author, but you've particularly recently started saying, well, my family has to be spoken of. And what's triggered that?
Well, what triggered that was my mother's death in December and my father's now very advanced dementia. I was talking yesterday, and this is no disrespect to him at all, I think he's a really good comedian, but about Jimmy Carr. Right? And Jimmy Carr is an incredibly prolific comedian, but he, just because of the type of comedian he is, doesn't talk about himself at all on stage, really. He just does very finely tooled, very clever jokes. And I've found that as I grow older, that I probably am losing the capacity for that to some extent. But what I go into, therefore, is more and more who am I and how can I tell my own story in a way that hopefully creates some kind of comedy. And so I have to work with what happens to me. And I am 51, and a very big happening in my life is that my parents died on the one hand, or a woman described it to me. She said she was very sorry that my father was no longer inside himself. And that's a very good description of what's happened to my father. But there is actually comedy there. There's lots of comedy there, certainly about the type of dementia. He has, I don't know if anyone has read me talk about this, but my father has Pick's disease. And Pick's disease is a type of frontal lobe dementia. And when the neurologist first spoke to me about it, he said, you'll see it'll include sort of irritation and sexual disinhibition and obscenity, and he'll be sort of angry all the time. And I said to the neurologist, sorry, does he have a disease or have you just met him? Because my dad has always been exactly like that. I mean, exactly. I feel he doesn't have Pick's disease, he has Colin Baddiel's disease. And you see, so there is comedy, you see, and what the way that he is with the stuff he does is unbelievably kind of socially awkward, what my dad does as a result of this disease, and it's horrible. It is funny, and it's like stupid to pretend it isn't funny, and so that's what I'm trying to do with this show, is find the funny in all this darkness.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea that you, even though you didn't forge lad culture, I think there was something tremendously helpful about the fact that people think, well, he's a bloke. We know that. He's got his bloke credentials. And look, he's talking about all of these things really, really openly. Those two things side by side, I think, have made you somebody that people absolutely trust.
Well,
because,
I don't know, maybe.
The touchy-feely bit is something people can get a bit frightened of.
Right.
But if you've got your bloke credentials and then you're touchy-feely, I think it's fantastic.
I think that one of the interesting things about doing a show partly about my dad is that my dad is a total bloke, or no, still is with the dementia, actually. If anything, the dementia has turned up his blokiness, like all other parts of him. Like, one of the things I cannot... My dad has forgotten many things, but he has not forgotten that he does not admit weakness. So if I try and talk to my dad about what are we going to do and, try and make him understand that he's vulnerable, he won't have it. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because, I would say he was a Welsh lad, my dad, and he will be a Welsh lad, when he dies. And that, to some extent, is what I have embraced and then moved away from as well.
Okay, so if we have the lights up on the audience, and we've got some microphones, so
Someone at the back.
Somebody at the back?
Someone at the back's kicking us off.
And then there's somebody at the front, yeah. Yes?
Journalistic Phenomena. Hi, David.
Hello.
I'm from a very similar background to you. I've got one parent from a Jewish Holocaust background, and who also passed away, my father, and my mother has dementia. And something I'm thinking about in terms of my identity, our identities are similar, in terms of that sense of otherness. And also, you might have seen things around issues around passed on trauma and genetically and also through the family of people from our background and similar backgrounds, whether you explored that in terms of your mental health issues.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of stuff there, actually.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 or 4 questions at a time,
Okay.
if that's all right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to have the lights up a bit more because I can't see the audience
There's
so
a gentleman
well.
there.
I wanted to say that it's marvelous to hear you talk about the fact that you lack this inhibition in expressing your emotions. But to my mind, that's the starting point, because the next stage then is intimacy and dependency. And I don't know whether I picked this up correctly or not, maybe wrongly, but you were quite eager to speak a lot when you talk about yourself and Frank, that it was his dependency which was critical, and that you were a little bit removed from that.
Well, I don't suggest that I chucked Frank. No, I don't.
No. This is more about how you see yourself, and I wonder whether, in some ways, with men, and I noticed that men, even when men have the capability to describe their feelings, they often then have difficulty in actually creating the dependency and intimacy.
Right.
And that's where the real treasure is.
Right.
And we somehow miss out on that.
Okay.
One really interesting thing to say.
One more question. Come on, men. Yes, okay, some chap there. There. Look,
There's a... Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you. I was going to ask about your willingness to express. Do you feel that is a product of your sort of white privileged masculinity? It's a similar masculinity to mine. Oh, we wear glasses and look quite nerdy.
We do wear glasses. Although I believe there are underprivileged people who wear glasses.
Really?
Yeah.
And so I was going to say, do you think there's a uniform path to expression, or do you think other people find it in different ways, and what the uniformity might be?
Right.
Okay,
Quite a lot of stuff.
That's quite a lot of stuff. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's very... that's a very different question from that one. How do you want me to...
Well, I mean, okay, let's just say that we talked about the trauma of the Holocaust and how that
Yeah.
kind of...
Well, I can answer the question straightforwardly in one way, which is I think the question was partly about have I done any exploration of the idea of inherited trauma. My mum was born in Nazi Germany and came over here when she was 3 months old. My grandparents were very wealthy industrialists in a place called Königsberg, and then arrived here with no money, and most of their family were murdered. And then my grandfather was interned on the Isle of Man as a friendly alien, which is, in 1940, the British government interned most of the Jewish refugees on the Isle of Man. I've written a novel about it. But anyway, that was a very traumatic thing. And my grandfather, actually, that grandfather was in and out of a mental hospital in Cambridge the rest of his life with clinical depression. But that's an interesting thing about depression there, which is that I became clinically depressed with nothing like the level of trauma that he had suffered. Most of his family had been murdered, he'd lost everything. You know, he was in a foreign country, he never learned to speak English really properly because he came here when he was 40. I think, why not? Why not be intensely depressed when I think of my grandfather? But I, to use this man's expression, I'm a fairly privileged white male. My sense from that is that depression can happen sort of fairly randomly, really. I think you probably do just have to be genetically or psychologically predisposed to it. But I have no idea whether or not that particular inheritance actually causes it. I wouldn't be able to tell you that. Mm-hmm. Well, the question, your point, I thought that was a really interesting point. We were actually talking about that just before we came on, about whether or not when men do evolve into what you call the kind of touchy-feely thing and are a bit able to talk about their emotions, do they actually form relationships with that sort of help? And I think I have done, but you made a point, which is, do men who can do that basically form those relationships with women? And to some extent, I would say, yeah, it's actually, I mean, certainly, if I thought about who do I spend most of my time talking about my emotions with, it's Morwenna, who is my partner. She's a woman who's very able to talk about her emotions, but that seems like a slightly weird thing to say, but I'm sure there are loads and loads of women who can't talk very easily about their emotions. That's something that we never really say. Is it, you know, where are the women who can't talk about their emotions? They're probably just not speaking, to be honest. At all. Yeah. But I'm sure they're out there, and it's difficult for them. But I think you might be right. I think that as a heterosexual man, probably once you develop this ability to talk about your emotions, whatever it is, you find a woman who you can imbue that with, and then probably less so your male friends, who you probably do still end up talking about football with. Although I have to say, one of the mistakes about that, I think, is an opposition between talking about your emotions and then sort of talking about football, as if talking about football was not emotional. It's fucking emotional. So I don't agree that those are necessarily two different things.
Yeah,
but it's a really good point.
It's a weird thing that, I mean, I've heard this phrase so often, where it's like men don't show their emotions, and anger's an emotion.
Yeah.
You know, screaming about for Arsenal is an emotional.
Yeah, and also, you know, you can talk about football in those ways, and you can talk about it in a really, you know, lyrical way, or whatever. There's lots of brilliant football writing that's demonstrated that. You know, not just football, but, you know, all sorts of other traditional male pursuits. You know. And then there was that question, which was basically, I was sort of saying that, trying to deal with that before, about whether or not being allowed to be the touchy-feely person, for want of a better phrase, is a kind of privileged middle-class thing. I think it might be a bit, because we very briefly mentioned it, and I guess I'll be talking about it more in this depression discussion that we're having, but I was a patron of a charity called Calm, which is designed to try and help men who might commit suicide not to, by providing a safe space for them to talk about their depressions. And I was patron of that for 7 years. And what I discovered when I was doing that is there definitely is a whole lot of other issues apart from your gender, but that interact with your gender, as to why you might or might not be able to talk about this stuff. So if I'm meeting a Scottish 21-year-old covered in tattoos bloke who had phoned the Calm helpline because he was about to commit suicide, it's clear to me that he does not have access to the template of talking about your emotions that I've had, because I've read a lot of Saul Bellow. Do you know what I mean? He just doesn't have that, and so it's really good that stuff like Calm exists. And in that sense, the cliche, men can't talk about their emotions, needs to be accepted at some point. What it really means is men like that can't talk about their emotions because they've never been given the opportunity to.
Yeah, but I think if you look at kind of films of heroes, you know, like James Bond doesn't divulge much, does he?
No, that's right.
And, you know, every film that, you know, of Wall Street or that sort of thing, I mean, you know, the classic hero, actually,
well, up to
Clint
a point,
Eastwood doesn't chat.
Well, no, but up to a point. You see, that is to do with how we've changed a bit, which is, you know, there's a kind of hunger, I think, for that kind of strong and silent man which persists, the John Wayne type. And yet, in superhero films, the most popular superheroes are Iron Man and Spider-Man, and they are flawed men.
Yes.
They are men who spend a lot of time being either and Batman, of course, uncertain about what they're doing, or ironic about what they're doing. And irony is a very important thing in all this. Is it possible to be a man and to talk about manliness without being ironic at the same time?
Any other questions? There's a man here, yes? Any other questions? You put your hands up if you'd like to. Yes, and there's somebody there too. Yes, one there.
There's a lot of people running around, but no one giving anyone a mic. Oh, you've got a mic, sir?
Yep.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, I'm also disabled, so 5 of my 15 disabilities affects my communication, so so if you can try and bear with me.
Sure.
Do you think that being depressed can be a positive thing and would help you with your creativity? Because you mentioned the negative, obvious side, and that's partly why you're here to kind of share that with us, and also what your grandfather went through. But then again, you know, as an artist, you're supposed to have poor mental health problems because that's supposed to make you better. So anyway.
Yeah, no, well, that was what
But
I was...
also, your point about being white and middle class
Yeah.
and privilege, and that's why you're in touch with your feelings.
Yeah.
I'm black, gay and disabled, and I'm in touch with my feelings. I didn't read a very thick, clever book with a very long name, but I guess my point is, if you are who you are and everyone's different, then you could be touchy-feely or comfortable with your male identity.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Well, I totally agree with what you finished saying, that, you know, this idea that it might be restricted to a certain type of bloke is wrong, and it should, you know, the ability to be able to talk about your emotions really needs to, the idea of it extending to all sorts of men is obviously key. But in terms of whether or not depression is a good thing, I sort of touched on that when I talked about how in my 20s I thought it might be cool to be depressed, and it isn't at all. It's really horrible. So I don't think that from an artistic point of view it is a good thing, and certainly when I was depressed I don't know if I was doing great work particularly, and certainly I was at the time I was doing a live unscripted comedy show every night on ITV, and that was really damaging, I think, because it was so stressful when I really needed to just be doing nothing. Having said that, I think that if you can get through it and you can talk about it, and there are things you can find in it as a writer or whatever it is that you might do that are useful, and it helps you see certainly other sides of yourself. And I'm someone who thinks that self-awareness is kind of what you should be looking for in life, that really we have nothing else to find except who we are. I don't believe in God or anything like that, so if I'm on a journey, it's to find out really just who I am and what it means to be human. And as such, I think being depressed, if that is part of your experience, it's good to go through it, is about all I can say.
Okay, we've got time for another couple of questions. There's one here. Can I just see if anybody else wants to ask a question? There's one there. Anybody on this side?
This guy has been waiting for a little while.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got two more questions. Thank you.
David, I was wondering if you could just explain whether your relationship with comedy has changed as you've grown older and you've performed in different contexts. Whether it's right to sort of set up a sort of binary sense of comedy being through as a form of therapy almost, or a form of escape, and whether in your early days comedy was a form of escape or it was a form of self-exploration, whether that's always been the case. And related to that, I was an English student, and one of the things that we studied in terms of the theory of comedy was that there's always this knife-edge moment almost between tragedy and comedy, and at some of the darkest moments of our lives, we tend to just laugh or giggle or do something inappropriate. I was wondering, in your comedy, whether you feel there is that kind of knife-edge between those two things.
Well, in terms of your first question, I mean, so my relationship with comedy has changed. I was definitely someone who, when I first started, partly just because of the environment, I started doing comedy at the Comedy Store. You had to go on as an open spot at midnight, and it was very macho, for want of a better word. And as a result, I think the comedy that engenders tends to be very bang, 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 bang. I remember I used to do this joke about my grandfather, and it said my grandfather died on the occasion of his 92nd birthday, which was a great shame as we were only halfway through giving him the bumps, right? And that is a joke I probably wouldn't do now because it isn't true. I mean, obviously, we didn't do that. I might do a version of it, but I wouldn't do... I'm much more likely now to talk about the fact that my grandfather had depression and was in and out of mental hospital and try and find the comedy and the truth of that than to look for a one-liner, which is not to do the one-liner thing down. It's really hard to write one-liners, but I think that just personally, as I've got older, I think I do want to use comedy as a form of self-exploration rather than just something which gets laughs. Getting laughs is still really difficult to do and can still be a form of self-exploration, even if it is just that by itself, but that's not the way I'm going with it. In terms of the relationship between tragedy and comedy, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to say anything new here. I can't remember who said, was it Woody Allen, who said that comedy is tragedy plus time, and I'm sure that remains true, and I'm sure it's very, very close. I think that things that are awful, I am of the belief that most of the time the best way of dealing with them is through comedy. It tends not to win awards. But you may have noticed that films that are funny don't win awards, And that's partly because comedy is about saying to the serious thing, maybe you're not that serious, as a way of dealing with it, as a way of us dealing with the worst things in life. And if you say you're not that serious, then you're less likely to win awards, because awards are looking for seriousness.
Okay. Final question from this person here?
Yeah, I don't go to soccer matches more than once a decade.
Okay.
And there's a lot of sort of man-type things I don't do. I have been in a men's group for 20 years, but there's still things that are in a fog. And I really am interested when I notice a clear thing for me about being a man. And I haven't, this is a clear thing to me, and I'd like your feedback. I haven't been able to bring myself to watch the film Billy Elliot.
Right.
What does that say?
Well, are you a Geordie? Or a minor? Or a ballet star? You're going to have to tell me more about yourself, and I'm going to have to join your men's group to actually answer why you personally can't watch Billy Elliot. I mean, one thing I would say is that Billy Elliot, like The Full Monty, is a film about masculinity. Though, I mean, and a brilliant one. There's a brilliant bit in The Full Monty. Sorry to move on to a different film, but it's a very similar type of film. There's a brilliant bit in The Full Monty that always makes me cry. Again, a man talking about him crying, that's good. Where Mark Addy, who is a large man, is talking to Leslie Sharp. They're in a relationship, and she thinks he's having an affair, but he eventually comes out with it. No, when I'm stealing off, what I'm doing is I'm going to learn how to dance. And then she says, well, why don't you tell me? And he says, well, I was ashamed. And then he says, who wants to see this dance? And she says, I do. Right? I'm going to cry now, just at the thought of it. And what I love about that is it shows how clearly that film, which at some level advertised itself as like, it was just a fun film about men stripping, is about male body image. It's about men feeling vulnerable about what they look like. And Billy Elliot is about a boy who feels that he's not quite matching up to his dad, the miner's, idea of what a man should be. And so there is this opening that is happening now, and very popular and very commercial, for narratives and stories to talk about what is a man, what is the flaws from the idea of being a man that can provide comedy and laughter and sadness and pathos.
Yeah. I think that
I think you should see it, by the way.
Yeah.
I think you'd be all right.
We'll all watch it with you if you like.
Yeah. You'll get through it. It's not like saying I can't face Shoah or something like that. It's like, it's okay, Billy Elliot, you'll get through it. Go and see the musical first, maybe. I don't know.
Okay, I mean, I want to say a couple of things. First of all, let's be clear, the touchy-feely thing, because I've said it, is really because that's one of the ways that men are put down by that phrase, as if this is sort of yuck. There's nothing wrong. We're all here because we believe this, with men being emotional, sharing emotions, and speaking their truths. I mean, that has to happen for people to understand who they could be. And all the things that are so painful about, I'm not allowed to be Billy Elliot, I'm not allowed to be this thing, I ought to be this thing. We still really are not communicating to boys, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old boys, the permission to be whoever they could be. And I think that's one of the big things. And it's very interesting that you're writing for children. You're not only a children's author, but you are a children's author. And to have men writing for children who, like yourself, are interested in the whole truthfulness about feeling, I think is a tremendous thing. And of course, you've got kids, so you want them to grow up knowing that truth's there. Well, as David said...
I feel you're winding up, aren't you?
I am.
Okay, before you wind up, I'm going to plug something.
Please do.
Which is the show that I'm talking about, which is called My Family, Not the Sitcom. I'm doing my last workshops. I do a sort of workshop where I try stuff out, and then I also speak to the audience afterwards about what they think about it at Soho Theatre in January. So please come to that if you're interested in what I've been saying about it.
That's great. Well, I mean, I wish it was longer because you're marvellous to talk to. You really are. You're marvellous to talk to.
Thank you very much.
And it's been great having you. And obviously, David is in the next session, the Black Dog session that follows the two keynotes we're about to hear. But can we thank him for coming?
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Cheers.
it's been great. Thank you, David.